Welcome everyone. As part of our research seminar series organized by the Research Lead Office of the Niagara Regional Campus and Niagara Health, today we will be going through the major components in conducting a research project to help you conduct a research project in the future. This first module is on formulating a research question, and it addresses the who's, what's, where's, when's, why's, and how's of the problem. This research seminar series is brought to you by Dr. Jennifer Sang, Dr. Han O Chung, myself, George Hu, and Dr. Sadiq Wira on behalf of the Niagara Regional Campus and the Niagara Health Research Lead Office. At the completion of this module, you should be able to describe the importance of research questions, formulate research questions using the PICOT variables, appraise your research question using the finer criteria, and evaluate your research question using refining criteria that we'll provide for you. So to start off, we want to do a little pre-test to see what you currently know, and at the end, you can see what you've learned through this module. And as we're going through these questions, think about what your answers would be to these problems, and we'll come back to these at the end. So the first question is, what is the first step in developing a research question? Is it A, having a problem that prompts clinical curiosity, B, completing a literature review, C, determining feasibility, or D, securing funding? Question 2. Which of the following is not one of the primary reasons why a literature review is a crucial step? Is it A, reveal gaps that exist in current literature, B, confirm any prior scholarship in the area to prevent duplication of work, C, contextualizing prior work in their contribution to the current understanding in the area, D, identify the most appropriate methodology for the question, or E, identifying any areas of controversy in the literature. And question 3. Which of the following research questions most closely follows best practice when you're developing a research question? Is it A, does eating an apple a day keep the doctor away? B, does consuming one serving of a green apple, Malus domestica, every 24 hours prevent a doctor's office visit? C, does eating an apple a day for 6 weeks improve HbA1c levels in patients with prediabetes compared to standard diet? Or D, does eating apples prevent colds? So now let's go on to the content of this module. So why do we need to spend time thinking about how to form a research question? Let's first go through the importance of the research question. All of you have lived in a house or a building before, I assume. Think about your research project as your house. In this case, your data collection forms the wall of your house. Your hypothesis, which drives your data collection, is the foundation of your house. So what's the research question in this analogy? The research question is the ground beneath the foundation upon which everything is built. Without a question, you can't have a hypothesis. And without a hypothesis, you wouldn't know how to study what you're interested in. And therefore, a research question forms the base of where you're going, so you need to have a very good question. If your foundation is built on something shifty, like in our analogy, a house built on sand, for instance, then everything following that will be focused on correcting the initial issue rather than making a beautiful home, or in our case, an excellent research project. Therefore, as quoted by Aslam and Emmanuel, the success of a research project largely depends on how well the research question is formulated. It's very important to know that the formulation of a research question is not a light bulb phenomenon. It doesn't just come about quickly. It's actually an iterative process where you have to repeat the process again and again in order to develop a sound research question that your project can be built on. Quoting Aslam and Emmanuel again, a research question is an uncertainty about a problem that can be challenged, examined, and analyzed to provide useful information. It must be specific and precise to guide the implementation of the project. So now, let's dissect the process of actually forming the question. The process doesn't actually start with the question itself. It begins when there's a clinical curiosity and when there's a topic or area that you're interested in. Most research projects stem from a curiosity that a clinician has in their daily clinical practice. I'm sure that every day you'll come across one or two clinical questions that you would like to conduct research on if you had the time and financial resources. Have you ever thought about how to convert your clinical question into a research question? And one basic point I would like to make is that without knowing what research is already out there, such as the hows, whens, wheres, whats, and whos, you will not be able to develop your research question. For instance, How does the condition progress? When do you start treatment? What condition, population, or outcome are you even investigating? Who are you doing the research on? And who will the research affect? For example, let's say you're an intensivist who works in the intensive care unit looking after patients with acute respiratory distress syndrome, or ARDS. You come across a potential new management for ARDS, which is proning, and you want to explore the possibility of conducting a study looking at the use of proning in patients with ARDS. Where would you start? So you'll actually need to start off with performing a thorough literature review to learn about the basics of the problem, the uncertainties that are involved, and to understand the boundaries between current knowledge and our gaps in knowledge. So let's break down the literature review into manageable parts, and we can use a little checklist to help us stay focused in our literature review. Specifically, your literature review should allow you to understand the basic biology and physiology of the clinical problem that you're interested in. In this case, you need to know about the biology and physiology of ARDS and the physiology of proning and why it works. The epidemiology of the clinical problem is also important to look up, as it will lend credence to the importance of your research. In this case, you need to look up the epidemiology of ARDS. And last but not least, as alluded to in the previous slide, it's crucial to learn about any potential knowledge gaps in the clinical scenario that you're interested in. In this case, you need to learn about what is already known about the use of proning in patients with ARDS. And these items constitute the background of your research project. This is what we need to do to prepare formulating our actual question. So by completing the literature review and understanding the background of the problem, you'll be able to get a sense of what is not known in the literature. And from this, maybe you want to build on existing knowledge. Maybe you want to tackle the problem from another angle. And this is why understanding the background is extremely important. Now we're going to focus on the specifics of your question, which is the foreground of your project. And this is the actual development of your research question itself. And to do that, we need to define the variables of the question, which are the measurable and modifiable characteristics that have clinical, population, and system-related importance. And luckily, we have a handy acronym, which is PICOT, which can help us out with this. P stands for population or problem. I stands for intervention or treatment or exposure of interest. C stands for comparator or control. O stands for outcome. And T stands for time horizon for measuring the outcome. And one thing to note is that the time horizon must be a consensus among all the research team members on when the outcome should be measured. This could be short, intermediate, or long-term follow-up. So let's take a moment and try and come up with a good research question. Say, for example, you wanted to test if proning was effective for ARDS patients. What would be a good research question that uses the PICOT format? Take a moment and think about this question. Is proning effective for ARDS patients? Well, in this case, there are a few problems with this question. Proning is our intervention, and ARDS patients is our population. However, we don't have a time period, so we don't know if we're measuring this over a couple of hours or over decades. We don't know what outcome we're measuring. Are we looking at symptoms of ARDS? Are we looking at mortality? Are we looking at quality of life? There's a lot of variables in this question that are missing. So here is an example of a better question. Take a moment, pause the video if you need to, and try to pick out the PICOT variables that are present in this question. And when you're ready, you can unpause the video. So here are the answers. The intervention is proning. The population is patients with severe ARDS. The time period is over 6 months. The outcome is mortality. And the comparison is standard therapy. Do you see how now what we're investigating is going to be much clearer than it was before? And keep in mind, in this scenario, we had all components of the PICOT, we had all the PICOT variables, but that doesn't necessarily have to be the case. Depending on the type of the study, a time period, outcome, or comparison may not be necessary. So, as you can see, by using the PICOT model, you can develop a number of different research questions. So how do you know which one's the best? For that, you can apply the finer criteria to optimize your research question. F stands for feasibility. This refers to the availability of resources, including staff, time, and funding. I stands for interesting. Your research has to be interesting enough in order to engage grant and manuscript reviewers. N stands for novel. No one likes old news, and you don't want to be repeating work that's already been done. Your question, again, should be filling a gap in the existing body of knowledge. E stands for ethical. Nowadays, no one can do research without obtaining Research Ethics Board approval, so your question must be ethical. And R stands for relevant. Being a clinician, unlike being a basic scientist, I'm sure that you're going to be interested in research that's relevant to your clinical practice. So going back to the question that we were working on before, let's try to apply the components of the finer criteria. Would this research be feasible? Sure, depending on the type of research that you want to do. If you want to take some patients from the ICU and try to use proning as a treatment, then maybe. Is it interesting? Well, if there's a possibility to improve patient outcomes in a significant way, then probably. What about novelty? That's where the literature review really comes in handy, and you have to figure out what research has already been done. With ethics, you have to make sure that proning is a technique that's based on existing research, and there's a rationale behind trying this new technique on patients. And finally, is it relevant? If you're not able to use proning as a treatment modality, even if it proves to be effective, then would there be a point of doing this research? So after applying the finer criteria, you should go through this last checklist of key refining questions to further develop your question. The first item, it asks, what is the appropriate stage for evaluation? This basically means what previous assessments have been made for the question that you're interested in. For instance, has a systematic review or meta-analysis been conducted? Or has there been a retrospective cohort study? Or has there been a prospective RCT? Your research should fill in a gap and build on existing knowledge that's already available. The second item asks if internal validity can be achieved and to what extent can external validity be achieved. In this case, internal validity refers to how well an experiment is done in avoiding confounders and bias. External validity refers to whether or not the results can be generalized to other situations and populations. This second item is largely dependent on your methodology and on feasibility. The third item asks, what will your circumstances permit? For instance, if you were to conduct a study in a community center, perhaps you're looking at a small observational study or a single center clinical study. It's unlikely that you'll be running large multi-center RCTs at a community center. And the fourth item asks to clarify key points in your question. For instance, check if your primary question could be broken down into 3 to 5 secondary questions, and whether or not this would help clarify the scope and depth of your research question itself. Also, make sure you clearly define the meaning of each of your PICOT variables. For instance, if you use the word youth, what do you mean by that? Also, make sure you carefully define where your population will be selected and who they'll be compared with. Try your best to find vague terms in your question and replace them with simpler and clearer ones. So, in summary, the research question is the ground beneath the foundation of your house. The formulation of the research question is an iterative process rather than a light bulb phenomenon. We also discussed the background and foreground components of the research question that include the literature review and then the components of PICOT. We also practiced applying the finer criteria to further optimize the question, and always think about the key questions that are essential to polishing your research question. So going back to the problems. The first one asked, what is the first step in developing a research question? If you still are unsure, take a moment, pause the video, and when you're ready, you can continue. So here's the answer. The first step in developing a research question is having a problem that prompts clinical curiosity. Before even starting to develop a question, you need to have a genuine curiosity about a clinical conundrum that faces clinicians in real life. A literature review is important to see if a question has already been answered or to see what's already known, but it's not going to be something that's going to generate a question itself. Feasibility itself is important as well, but it should not be your primary consideration early on. It should, however, be considered later on as you refine your question. And securing funding is a practical reality for many questions, but it comes later on in the process. Question 2. Which of the following is not one of the primary reasons why a literature review is a crucial step before forming a research question? And here's the answer. D. Identify the most appropriate methodology for the research question. Identifying the methodology is not the primary reason for a literature review in this step of your research question development. The methodology should be determined to best suit the question itself, rather than determining the methodology first. You can, however, do a literature review to see what methodology has been the most effective for questions that are similar to yours once your question is already developed. And question 3. Which of the following research questions most closely follows best practice in developing a research question? Or in other words, which of the following is the best question? And here is the answer. C. Does eating an apple a day for 6 weeks improve HbA1c levels in patients with prediabetes compared to standard diet? The reason why this question is correct is because it most closely follows the PICOT format. P is patients with prediabetes, I is eating apples, C is standard diet, O is improvement in HbA1c levels, and T is the 6-week time frame. Again, remember the components of the PICOT variables, because some of the other questions are vague. And for B specifically, don't let the scientific sounding words fool you. That answer still lacks the PICOT and finer criteria. So that concludes this module. If you have any feedback for today's session, please feel free to email us. Thank you everyone, and enjoy the rest of your day.